So, this talk explores the category of colonial rubbish in relation to collecting practices in 19th century Britain and India. It proposes that Protestant, in particular nonconformist missionary activity, and the English East India Company constructed a new understanding of Hindu artifacts through the lens of rubbish and what Latour and Weibel term iconoclash. Just as rubbish acts as a median category, which enables objects to be revalued as worthwhile or worthless, an old chair from a skip to the antique store and back again, iconoclash is the medium term between iconophilia and iconophobia. When taken together, I suggest that these can be highly productive lenses for viewing the contested, volatile status of Hindu images in 19th century collections and how they entered markets. This is to question what a market is, not the 18th century mercantilist world of the mercantile fetish, but supposedly relinquished idols, i.e. religious artifacts collected by EIC officials and non-evangelical missionaries. These were sometimes nodal points of convergence as these opposed collecting practices converged over certain types of art objects. Were these objects becoming mere souvenirs or specimens, or as sensationalist, horrible idols, emptied of all of their ritualistic artistic powers through their transference out of the temple, processional, or archaeological context? Or as the embodiment of colonial ideas of rubbish and iconoclash, were they in fact able to generate all sorts of new or renewed powers? The residual covert category of rubbish may facilitate the transformation of things into either transient or obdurate objects of value, but it also signifies as a form of danger. As Michael Thompson, Gay Hawkins, and Stephen Muka propose, the category of rubbish is critical to the creation and destruction of value. Social envy involves invidious distinction, which goes beyond merely the ownership of desired objects to privilege the ability to be wasteful with them. To be wasteful is a competitive achievement. The desire to possess is a desire to make waste. What results is a theory of rubbish which is central to the construction of colonial value. Rubbish is the condition of possibility for any reevaluation of things that might have become either extremely valuable or useless. Iconoclasm, I argue, produces its own form of idolatry, which plays out the naive belief in others' naive beliefs, where to break the idol is to preserve, perhaps even to activate it, literally in colonial museums. Conversion bears within itself the possibility of a subversion of secular power. It is no coincidence that the rise of dissension in Britain intersected with the pastoral, militant, and I would suggest the neglected artistic agenda of non-congressional evangelicals in India. Both missionaries and colonial officials employed an uneven rhetoric of both idolatry and iconoclasm by which they attempted to justify the collecting of Hindu art objects. In effect, they activated practices of iconoclash. As a discourse, idolatry was radically reinvented by Enlightenment thinkers intent on debunking absolutism and misinformed Christian superstition. Voltaire's philosophical dictionary dismisses idolatry as a false concept lacking analytical value. It is an insult, a term of outrage. His argument is accompanied by a theory of how superstition and idolatry emerged historically in the context of a wider monotheistic consensus which embraced most civilizations. All religions sprang up from a natural and universal human awareness that is a superior power which ignorant people worship in a figurative manner. In many cultures, this led to a dual system which combined popular polytheistic worship through images with elite philosophical monotheism. In contrast with early theologians, late 18th century writers, including scholars and antiquarians, in addition to colonial Orientalists, encouraged a range of ancient and contemporary faiths, which they believed to be based on or concerned with idolatry. In dispute with company officials who denied coevalence to Hindu practices, early 19th century missionaries wrote relentlessly about what they perceived to be the excessive proliferation of Hindu gods as metonic of cultural degeneration. According to London Missionary Society Reverend Joseph Mullins, quote, Hindu idolatry has been sinking lower and lower. It has grown more debased in its number of gods, the older images, of gods and goddesses have something of manly beauty, but what image can be more ugly than Juggernaut or more ridiculously contemptible than Dakani Roy? End quote. Unlike company officials who acquired Hindu images through theft, gift, prize, or looting, missionaries collecting entailed a rhetoric of legitimization, a theory of rubbish and of extraction of the sacred from the places they themselves could not enter, for example, shrines, temples, or elite homes. Getting a hold of images was the most convincing form of material evidence of conversion. As such, they signified as rarities whose incomplete secularization generated a heightened fascination upon their transfer to London. Homi Bhabha suggests that the paradox of this partial diffusion of Christianity exposes the inability of European knowledge systems to reproduce in the colony. In his thesis, British forms of knowledge and power have a fatal flaw in that they cannot be successfully translated to a subject population denied the possibility of modern individualism. And this is not just about the forms of political representation. It extended also to conversion. Evangelicals like Charles Grant believed that Christianity had to function as a form of policing. As control, it brought out the pastoral dimensions of governmentality. Pastoral care could be made to work with the political model of despotism. Free subjects had no space here in relation to the overarching ruling figure. As opposed to the emphasis on civil society and the monetary or commodity monopolies on circulation in the company's discourse on trade, conversion stressed the flock education and conversion as its species of political economy. Bhabha uses conversion as a device for thinking about the question of agency in relation to ambivalence, mimicry, sly civility, and the limits of Western systems of representation. In this project of despotic pastoral Christianity unfolds a space for potential resistance to missionary discourse. Bibles become fetishes or snuff paper, and images, whether Protestant or Hindu, assume an unheimlich, even magical agency. The anxiety expressed about a Bible becoming rubbish is mirrored by idols becoming partially valuable in new, unpredictable ways after conversion. The kind of fear in the museum catalogs and the fiction which will be discussed shows that colonists believe in the partial intransigence of these objects, their refusal to become what Nicholas Thomas has termed converted artifacts. While Prakash Gupta and Mark Elliott argue that the educatory agenda of colonial museums failed to translate to India, as it became enmeshed with spectacle, superstition, and illegibility, I suggest that this ethic of the Wonder House also informed the display tactics of Oriental Repository in London. In the early 19th century, as techniques of observation became increasingly fluid, mobile and abstracted from any founding site or referent, they kick-started a reactionary desire for immersion into a range of spectacles: mesmerism, panoramas, magic lantern shows, dioramas, and ambitious museum displays of non-Western artifacts. I propose that the Oriental Repository became entangled in this regime of the ephemeral. Its ad hoc collections, illegibility, and later its homeless status not only unveil a culture of now forgotten museums, but it also indicates a profound ambivalence concerning the display and classification of Indian artifacts. Criticized for its lack of access, poky library, and the director's unwillingness to accommodate visitors, the absence of a catalog and the motley unlabeled display of artifacts, the museum was condemned by contemporaries as a quote, filthier than a tavern. In March 1841, the East India magazine condemned it as, quote, very deserted in appearance, where the most valuable Oriental collection in the world is virtually sealed up, end quote. Focusing on the natural history and cartography of the geographical areas it wanted to conquer and document, the repository acted as more as a center of governmental calculation than as an exhibition for public instruction or amusement. Apart from a Babylonian stone rumored to be from the Tower of Babel, a tessellated Roman floor discovered in London. It emphasized objects of trade, especially natural history specimen from Java, which had recently been captured from the Dutch. In 1855, architect James Wyatt remodeled the East India House's tea sale room as an extension to the repository, the effect being a fantastic Orientalist space which visitors imagined to be like entering a Hindu temple. Ironically, then its scalloped arches, courtyard-like layout, and marble ornamentation are far closer to a mid-17th century palatial or funeral Mughal Islamic architecture coupled with Gothic proportions and ornament. Following the collapse of the company in 1858, the repository was dissolved and its site relinquished by Parliament. Objects of intrinsic value or the rubbish of a bankrupted system, the company's collections remained in storage for 11 years until, as part of a subsequent governmental reform of imperial administration, they were shifted between temporary locations in London. In its first transient home, the Fife House, Whitehall visitors complained that its disrupted taxonomy in a, quote, maze of skylit chambers and passages was, quote, grievously muddled. Hindu images crammed into cases or treated as though they were valueless. Lying discarded in the grounds were some of the most celebrated pieces of Buddhist sculpture, literally as rubbish. A series of reliefs from Amarvati, excavated by Colonel Mackenzie in the 1810s. Several of these sculptures landed in the India Museum, Calcutta, the Madras Museum, or as decorative spolia in Robinson Square. The stupa fragments that were shipped to London became known as the Elliot Marbles by an appreciative metropolitan press. And here I quote the Illustrated London News. A more interesting collection of sculpture does not exist, and many of them will bear favorable comparison to the Elgin marbles in beauty of design, while they greatly exceed them in finish and careful execution. An extensive review of James Ferguson's Tree and the Serpent, a publication which relied heavily on iconographic analysis of these sculptures, proposed that the Ellis marbles be studied more minutely for ethnological purposes. The book's photographs must be supplemented by the physiognomic studies which would trace the racial origins of the gods and persons depicted. This ethnographic turn provided the raison d'etre of the repository in the 20 years after the company's collapse. Now open far more frequently, it received 42,545 visitors in less than 2 years. The Working Men's Club and the Institut union requested extending opening hours for the, quote, very great service to citizens as a means of industrial instruction, as also of rousing their taste and of stimulating intellectual inquiry and research. Under the directorship of he was not a dictator, the directorship of Forbes Watson, the repository funded the publication of his ambitious photographic series, The Peoples of India, which acted as a miniaturized and indexical supplement to the museum's reorganization of its collections. Watson filled the principal room of the Fife House with life-size clay models of every tribe in North India, Kabul, and Tibet, accompanied by photographs and electrotype casts of hands, faces, and feet by the Schlingenweit brothers, as well as some of the Amarvati marbles. The repository's emphasis on physiognomic ethnography was vehemently opposed by the Christian missionaries who complained that the science of phrenology endorsed the wretched hierarchy of heathenism. They condemned what they perceived to be the absence of critical distance in the repository's exhibitionary ethic, which the London Missionary Society's museum aimed to correct. The perceived ambiguities and dissimulation in company policies towards Hinduism climaxes several times, perhaps, however, most strangely in the case of a Bengali goddess. In 1818, a group of Calcutta Brahmins prophesied the arrival of the Islamic Hindu cholera goddess, allied to Kali, known to Muslims as Allah Bibi, or Lady of the Flux, or as Alai Kandi by Hindus. Priests encouraged local communities to donate money and cowrie shells as not to incur her wrath. According to Keith, a local missionary, quote, An actual soi-disant incarnation or avatar of Allah Bibi appeared a few days ago in the village of Salakia. She sat there for 2 days in all of the state of a Hindu goddess, having a young Brahmi attending to her as a priestess, end quote. In the middle of the 1817 to 21 cholera epidemic, the worst of the 19th century, Allah Bibi appeared in human form in villages all across India. At Salkia, the district magistrate sent his respects and requested the honor of an interview with the deity. Reluctantly, a group of fearful sepoys seized her. She was tried in the court and sentenced for 6 months hard labor as an impostor. Could a deity be deemed a sentient being capable of accepting property? Although the colonial penal code privileged a strand of Hindu thought, which is aniconic and anti-theistic, in practice, it was hybridized by its contact with Islamic, British, and Roman legal codes, the result being a colonial confusion over divine personhood. The outcome of the majority of these cases concerned with the De Witter lands, or revenue-free temple property, stressed the concept of the ownership of the deity as an entity in which property is vested for worship. Against the grain of the god's other legal incapacities, property rights enabled the colonial state to exclude what they saw as the agency of the middleman, or temple Brahmins. Colonial officials actively placed themselves within the ambit of Hindu temples by collecting and redistributing revenues, arbitrating disputes over ritual prerogatives, renovating and rebuilding temples, giving presents to the deities, and participating in festivals. Temples were lucrative. Colonial officials claimed to use them in a purely instrumental manner by assuming the role of royal devotees. Missionaries argued that any contact with Hindu gods was polluting. Pressurized by the missionary position of power in Parliament, in 1841, the company withdrew from Indian religious establishments. As Conan Davis suggests, this new policy of religious disengagement ricocheted into mass rioting and signaled an incompleteness of cultural symbolic constitution of the colonial state. Like its heterogeneous diasporic museum, the company, which compared with the militant performativity of the evangelicals, lacked a clear mission statement. So now talking about the London Missionary Society's museum. That work? No? No. Okay, I lost the slides there. But I think that's not too horrible. So, the problematic status of Indian converts forced a reform-oriented English law. Oh yeah, better. Yeah. Oh, then we're past that. Oh, there's, okay. That's the one, that's the last one. There we go. Sorry about that. The problematic status of Indian converts forced a reform-oriented English law to deal with the question of their rights under law, even as it sought to minimize the relevance of converts' religious beliefs. This legislated subjectivity acted as a fuse to the already fraught relations between belief and law and between conversion and assimilation and transgression. Whilst often treated as dead by their former Hindu communities, their property rights erased, and the lease of life that converts were granted under civil law was founded on an equally unreal fiction, the denial of their new religious identity. Perhaps paradoxically, this devaluation of belief and denial of individual agency and the decision to convert is played out with the most frequency in missionary literature. In these accounts, the formal rituals of baptism and the relinquishment of idols seem to be all that is needed as evidence of conversion. Rarely do these accounts mention the self-appropriation of Christian ethics of interiority. In India, museums and exhibitions generated a highly charged and destabilizing momentum of rumors centered on the threat of missionary conversion. According to colonial reports, rural communities in the South perceived colonial motives behind agriculture exhibitions to be transformed of rice paddies into fields with cows for beef to feed the converted. And the presence of Indian artifacts in the London Missionary Society's museum elicits a profound ambivalence about their potential, even metonymic animism. Established in 1814, the same year as the company's Indian Museum, Calcutta, the London Missionary Society's museum, here I'll be calling it the LMS Museum, deliberately distanced itself from the possibility of signifying as Jadugur. Its foundation followed swiftly the company's reluctant official sanctioning of missionary activity in its settlements for the first time. Initially located in the impressive neoclassical headquarters of the Society at Old Jewry, by 1826 it relocated to Austin Friars. Mimicking the visitor tactics of the company's Oriental repository, the LMS Museum also policed entry through a fee, a ticket of admission signed by its directors, and by even more restricted opening hours. According to one London guide in the museum's own catalog, visitors were expected to make significant financial donations to be horrified, sympathetic, and uplifted by the artifacts on display. The LMS Museum acted as a militant theater of conversion through the staging of its trophies as part of conflictual performativity that both attempted to break from and accelerate the classificatory norms of fetish, idolatry, and iconoclasm. Its early collections consisted of the souvenirs of first-generation missionaries and a few donations by naval officers, including a sloth, a serpent, ladies' shoes, an elephant tusk, shells, drums, baskets, seaweeds, and buffalo horns from India. Its projected identity involved an implicit critique of the Oriental repository in terms of object choice, techniques of display, and the agenda of context making. As the hub of missionary activity, the museum targeted a public steeped in evangelical literature. I quote here the museum's catalog. The most valuable and impressive objects in this collection, the numerous horrible idols which have been imported from India, China, and Africa. In the case of both the Pacific and India, images acquired from the converted are frequently bunched together with no labeling at all and no acknowledgement other than their status as rubbish. In contrast with the Oriental Repository's exposition of the heterogeneous collections of its former servants, the exhibitionary agenda of the Missionary Museum operated through the cult of the specimen. The directors selected gods in the singular. In the catalog of 1826, these gods are described in terms of their attributes or the controversy that they generate, especially Rama, dismissed as an evil adulteress, or Juggernaut, then the focal point of public debate. Conspicuously absent from this display was Siva Linga. Unlike the images of Polynesian gods, whose phalluses they hacked off, missionaries condemned linguism as the most hideous, almost unrepresentable form of idolatry. From accounts of its collection at the end of the 19th century, these major gods were supplemented by subaltern folk deities, Takashi Roy, and by a range of objects associated with the missionaries believed to be either practices or analogous with their own theological cause, or the most absurd demonic practices. Increasingly, ritual performed a critical role in the LMS's self-representation. These ritual objects included a stone worshipped in the Pungat Hills of South India, in front of which people drank the blood of wild beasts, the hook from which spring festival of hook swinging in Bengal, the mask and costume of a devil dancer from Ceylon, and a rosary bead bag which simulated the appearance of a cow's mouth. By the 1890s, when the museum moved to Bloomfield Street, it sanctioned the photographing of a number of Indian objects for the English Illustrated magazine. Here, the photographer, possibly under missionary guidance, selected the most hideous and crudely made and monstrous gods. The spoon, excuse me. Against the grain of their earlier confinement behind glass, most of these objects were now, quote, leading an active life on tour at numerous provincial exhibitions, while the deities were kept in a waiting room in Salisbury Square. By this time, LMS missionaries in Britain began objecting to their metropolitan museum's demands for cultural classification. Their letters to the LMS directors disclosed a certain anxiety about applying taxonic misnomer of fetishism and idolatry to what they increasingly viewed to be complex hybrid societies. In this collection of heterogeneous objects, evangelical missionaries redistribute the agency of destruction. Their half-made converts do the dirty work of empire. They just pick up and ship back the pieces. In this battle from the invisible, and here I quote Nietzsche, there are no more ancient idols in existence. That does not prevent their being believed in, and they are not usually called idols, end quote. Thank you.